I picked up a phone book and I just looked to see, is there a listing for Industrial Light and Magic?
No.
And wow, there is. There's a number right here. I was 15 at the time. I don't think he knew.
This is the
how old I
beginning of
was.
Photoshop. This is it. I am Russell Preston Brown. Let's welcome you to another episode of Photoshop Archives here at ILM. I asked these gentlemen, where did this Photoshop all begin? And I think it starts with that spark of creativity in both of you. John, is it true that if Star Wars didn't exist, would Photoshop exist?
Yeah, probably not. We grew up in a household where Dad was a nuclear engineering professor. So science was an important part of this, science and engineering, but art was also really valued. Both of us grew up in Ann Arbor, which is a very cold climate during a large part of the year. People that grow up in cold climates develop indoor hobbies. I indulged myself with things like building plastic model kits and then scratch building them, and then some more technical pursuits, like I taught myself basic digital and analog electronics, and then very simple computer programming on an Apple II.
Is this 1977?
Well, this was all through the 70s. And, Tom had a whole series of hobbies as well.
Yeah. My hobbies were building model airplanes and writing computer programs.
Hobbies play a key role here with both of you.
Oh, yeah. And the other big hobby that both of us indulged ourselves in was photography. And we got that from Dad. We did our own developing and printing. So Dad built a darkroom in our basement. A lot of these hobbies that I was pursuing, I got interested in doing stop motion. So I did little clay animations and really enjoyed film. I loved films. And I was particularly interested in films that included scenes in them that were sort of obvious by their nature. They couldn't have just gone out and shot somewhere. It was some kind of fabricated imagery. And I was fascinated by how that was done. And that was one of the other things I would play around with was, hey, could I play with special effects techniques to make these same sort of impossible shots? It wasn't something that I thought seriously as something I could do as a career till Star Wars came out. And when Star Wars came out, suddenly that was kind of a revolution. Prior to that, anytime you had sort of ambitious fantasy content, there was some science fiction movie, it took a great deal of suspension of disbelief because you could tell exactly how it was done. That was a painted backing or that was a miniature because you could see the wires on it or whatever. There's a lot of visible artifice there. And Star Wars was really a big jump forward in something that was really very ambitious, imaginative science fiction that just had a level of authenticity and believability that hadn't really been present before that. And there was a lot of new thinking that was going into how that movie was made with the development of motion control, with really high quality blue screen extractions, all that kind of stuff. So it felt like there was a revolution happening in filmmaking. And I got super excited about that. About a year after Star Wars came out, this was May of 1978, my dad had a professional conference in Anaheim, the Anaheim Convention Center. My younger brother Pete and myself came along, and the idea was while Dad was at the conference, Uncle Bob was going to take Pete and I to Disneyland right across the way. I had just read this Cine Fantastique magazine that had a making of Star Wars issue, and it had these substantial interviews with all the principals of ILM. John Dykstra, Dennis Muren, Ken Ralston. I was really excited, like here I am in California, right near the heart of where all this exciting new stuff is happening. And I picked up a phone book and I just looked to see, is there a listing for Industrial Light and Magic?
No.
And wow, there is. There's a number right here, and there's a phone right here.
Didn't have a secret name, didn't have.
No, it was just Industrial Light and Magic was listed in the phone book. And so I called, and I got a hold of Grant McCune, who was head of the model shop. And I said that I was a model maker and I was interested in working in film. I was 15 at the time. I don't think he knew.
This is the beginning of Photoshop. This is it. This is the moment, wasn't it?
So yeah, Grant was really kind. He said, well, why don't you come on down and we'll show you around. So the next day, instead of going to Disneyland, so I didn't.
Good
I skipped
decision.
Disneyland.
Good decision.
Screw that. Okay.
Wait, what about Disney? Wait a minute. There's that. Okay.
So the next morning, like early in the morning, he drove me. It was like 8:30 in the morning from Anaheim up to Van Nuys, where ILM was. and he dropped me off. Lauren Peterson was my tour guide. So he took possession of me, and I went to dailies in the morning where they were working on the original Battlestar Galactica. So I saw all these composites in progress, and them making comments about, yeah, that Viper's a little magenta. Let's add 2 points of green to it, and you saw these shots taking shape. I went out onto the stage where they were photographing miniatures. I went to the model shop where they were building miniatures for an upcoming episode. I went talked to the guys in the optical department where they're putting the composites together. So I spent a whole day kind of immersed in how ILM was actually doing the work, seeing it in person. And these were just the nicest people you could ever meet.
And you're 15.
This is what I want to do.
Why didn't you just start working there then?
Because I was 15 years old. I left that feeling like, okay, I know what I want to do now. And then every step along the way after that was like, how do I get to being here in this company?
Lead us to the next step in this.
All right. Well, so the next step for me was, so I still had 2 years of high school left after this. But I figured I want to go to film school.
Okay.
And I want to go to film school in LA because that's where the industry is, at least that's where it was at the time. So I decided I was going to go to the USC Film School. My first jobs in the film industry were as a model maker because this was a skill that I could demonstrate. And my first jobs in the film industry while I was a student at SC were as a model maker. I got interested in motion control systems. So I had this photography background as a kid, and I was around these robotic camera systems that were shooting the miniatures that I was building. And I just thought these were the coolest things ever. They, moving and repeating the motion precisely. And there were not companies that sold these as commercial units. Everybody who had a motion control system had built it themselves. These were all kind of homebrew at the different companies. And I decided that all right, my next thing is I'm going to build a motion control system.
I thought of that when I was a kid too.
Exactly. So I learned basically how they worked. And my final project at USC, I built a 4-channel motion control system that I bolted onto an Oxbury animation stand.
Wow.
And the last thing I did there was I shot a 2-minute art film that was using this slit scan technique that Doug Trumbull had famously done on the Stargate sequence at the end of 2001.
Aha. We're here because of 2001 as well then.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, Doug Trumbull was a huge influence on me, yeah. So I thought I knew sort of how that worked, and I used this, the computer-controlled camera to kind of figure out exactly how it worked, and I did this little art film as an exploration of that. And about a year after I graduated, I got a call from one of my instructors at SC. And apparently, I didn't know this until about 10 years ago, but I found out that that was apparently a regular occurrence, that about once a year, somebody from ILM or Lucasfilm would call up SC and say, all right, who's the next Walter Murch? And they were kind of regularly looking for who are the hotshots who've just graduated. So I got a call from one of my instructors who said ILM called and they were looking for motion control camera assistants. They wanted to know, has anybody graduated recently who'd be a good candidate? And I told them, yeah, there's a guy who graduated a year ago, would be perfect for you guys. Based partly on the strength of showing, that I built this homebrew motion control system as part of my student project, I got hired here in the camera department.
Did you meet anyone at that time who you had met when you were 15?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Lauren Peterson and Steve Gawley. And
Did they remember you?
Lauren did, for sure, because he spent the whole day with me.
Wow.
But yeah, I met all those guys back in May of '78. 8 years later, now I'm working with them, and that was amazing.
Fall in love with something you love to do, and someone will pay you to do it. Fall in love. So you fell in love with your hobbies.
I'm sure a lot of people have similar stories
Yeah.
of having a passion growing up and pursuing that, and now you're employed professionally doing it.
We're getting
Okay,
closer,
so
closer.
now I'm working at ILM as a nighttime camera operator.
Okay.
My hobby of motion control is now my profession. So my new hobby, I got interested in computer graphics. I, like Tom, taught myself basic computer programming. I was not nearly as proficient as Thomas. Tom's astounding programmer. I wrote a ray tracing program, and Meanwhile, Thomas was in graduate school. And I remember complaining to Thomas once about the Macintosh API for displaying pictures. I'd written this ray tracing program that, like a lot of people, if you saw it back in the 80s, there were a lot of people who were making images of chrome spheres over checkerboard planes.
I remember that.
I was one of them. Okay. And I was complaining that it was kind of a pain to display an image on a Macintosh, because the API for doing it meant that you had to talk to the window manager and the palette manager and all this stuff that I wasn't particularly interested in and seemed like it was a lot of work to implement, when all I wanted to do was figure out how bright a pixel should be. And Tom said, well, I've written a whole suite of tools that do that stuff. Use my tools to do it, and just have your programs write raw images to disk.
Why was Thomas doing this?
All right.
Thomas.
Okay, this is a story of like two paths. John had his path, and then I had my path, and we sort of collided in 1987, and Photoshop came to be. My hobby was computer programming, and I also had a lot of experience in the darkroom, so I understood the details of imaging. And I turned my computer programming into a profession, sort of a hobby profession, because it was a part-time job, and I kept that job and got very good at writing commercial programs. And then went to graduate school, and I had a fellowship from the Office of Naval Research, which required me to be a full-time student, so I could not keep my part-time job. In graduate school, I was in a PhD program at the University of Michigan, and my research topic was computer vision, which everybody knows what that is now because of the
I don't know what that is.
Magic of AI. It's figuring out what taking a digital image and figuring out what's in it. This is a thing that's been solved in the last 5 years, pretty much. But I was doing research in the early '80s, and it was not a solved problem. And the task I was doing was trying to figure out how to recognize objects and images when they're overlapping in sort of random ways. In the process of doing this research on computer vision algorithms, the first step of most computer vision algorithms is image processing algorithms, because you have to take a digital image and you have to process it in some way to make it more suitable for recognizing the objects in it. So I had written a bunch of tools as part of my research to do image processing. And the first thing you want to do is be able to see what the image is. So I had written a display utility that would display the image. And the computer I had at the time was a Macintosh Plus, which had a black and white display. And just to be clear, that's black or white.
It's one bit, yeah. So to display a grayscale was, dithered.
It had to do a number of dithering algorithms built into it. And it could even display a color image, because it would do the math to convert it to a grayscale image, and then it would do the math on the fly to do the dithering. So you basically see a grayscale version of a color image, but I could actually process color images.
I'm indulging my hobby of computer graphics, and I visited Thomas back in Ann Arbor, and he showed me what he was working on. And seemingly just a few months before that, I'd gotten a demo in ILM's computer graphics department of the Pixar image computer. The Lucasfilm computer division, before they got sold off as Pixar, had them built. When he formed that group, he gave them 3 mandates: build a digital picture editing system, digital audio editing system, and a digital optical printer. When I got hired, Steve Jobs had just bought that group, and they became Pixar. But ILM kept a lot of the equipment and started up a computer graphics department, because ILM was seeing that there's a future in computer graphics and that we want to be part of this. As a camera operator, I did get a demo of some of the capabilities of the new ILM computer graphics department, and one of them was seeing the Pixar image computer.
John,
Yes.
at this time, you are the longest serving ILM employee to date.
At the moment, there is nobody here with an earlier hire date.
And I am the longest serving Adobe systems employee to date. I've worked there for 40 years. You worked here, we'll call it
39.
Let's call it 40. Let's just call it
39 and a half.
Okay, we're going to call it. We're going to call it. We're both worked at these companies for 40 years. I think that's pretty cool and why we're here today. Now continue with our story.
Yeah. So I got this demo of the Pixar image computer, and this was essentially a high-res frame buffer with some smarts. It was a peripheral that hung off of a Sun workstation. And at the Sun workstation, you could issue some command lines that would then execute image processing operations on the Pixar. And the demo that I got isn't going to sound like much. They loaded an image that had been scanned from a piece of negative into the high-res frame buffer of the Pixar, and they sharpened it. And that was kind of the whole demo. I was really impressed with what I saw because of the implications of what that meant. That if you could take an image from a piece of film, you could turn it into numbers on the computer. You could manipulate those numbers on the computer and put them back out into film. That meant that there was no limit to what you could do in the middle stage. That was going to change everything about how we worked. And I felt like I've just seen the future, and this is going to change everything about what we do here. And so I kind of left that demo with my head kind of spinning of, oh boy, this is sci-fi. This is the future. And it seems like it was a month or two later that I was visiting Tom. And like, I really wanted to play around with that. But, Pixar's first business model when Steve Jobs hired them, was they were going to sell the Pixar image computer as a kind of high-end image processing device for anybody who could afford it. And I think the initial price was $120,000. So it wasn't like people weren't going to buy those, companies were going to buy them. I think they were selling them to U.S. Geological Survey and NSA and other three-letter organizations. So there wasn't something that a hobbyist was going to be able to play with, even though I really was excited about that. And then just a short time later, Thomas showed me what he was working on for his thesis work, and it was almost the same thing. He had a whole suite of image processing tools that ran inside a virtual frame buffer with a command line interface. It was basically just what I saw. But now this was something that ran on an inexpensive personal computer, something that I could afford to own.
Key. That's what we've all been waiting. Was Levels one of those tools?
No, not yet. There was an Equalize tool, I think, but
Levels. I'm waiting for Levels.
That came later. Right around that time, Apple announced the Macintosh 2. That was their first color computer. So this was a computer with a faster processor. It had a math coprocessor that could do floating point operations much quicker. It had more memory, and most of all, it had a color display. And this was not cheap. Like if you got it with all those things on it, it was like $5,000. And my dad was a professor at the University of Michigan, and he had a faculty discount for those. So I think it was something like 20%. And so I asked if he would buy a fully loaded Macintosh 2 for me with his faculty discount so I could save whatever it was, $1,000 off the price. Tom asked, hey, when that computer arrives, can I keep it for a couple of weeks? Because I want to get my image processing code up and running in color. I just want to see it in person. So I said, okay, fine. And at the end of that, he, as I alluded to earlier, he'd said, hey, just use my tools to display your images. He said, I'll leave a set of those tools on the computer when we send it out to you. Tom got his code up and running on that computer and then sent it out to me. And that satisfied me, I think, for a month or two playing with that. And I think one weekend I called him and said, how hard would it be to take the core of these tools, reading images from disk, the displaying them, changing magnification, all like the core of those, and turn it into a double clickable Macintosh application with menus and windows. I think Tom was intrigued by the idea and said, well, I mean, the fundamentals of that wouldn't take more than about a weekend. And so that I think that next weekend he cobbled together a thing that was called Display. And that was really all it did, was it could read images off a disk and could display them in a window that you could resize, and it could display them as color or black and white dithered, and you could print them out onto a laser writer.
Tell me the year again.
That was 1987.
87.
Yeah.
That started a process where a lot of FedEx envelopes would go from Michigan to California because that was the fastest way to get that much data across the country.
Eventually, we started using, I think I had a 1200 baud modem, and it still took like 45 minutes to transmit the latest build of Photoshop to me in California. So this started off kind of as a hobby thing where Tom had tinkered this together, and then I would play with it. I'd say, oh, this is really cool. Hey, I took one of my ray traced images and I took it over to the computer graphics department. I loaded it up on the Pixar, and the gamma was wrong on it. Do you think you could add a gamma correction function to it? And Tom put it, one evening he put in a gamma correction function. And I got him, I think, the specs for the Pixar image file format to him. And I gave him a couple of sample images and the spec for how it worked. And he wrote support for reading and writing the Pixar image file format. And I think at the time there was a company that made this really clever black and white scanner called ThunderScan. It was a clever idea. You could take a dot matrix printer.
I did that.
And you could take the ribbon out of the printer and you could replace the ribbon with this little scanning cartridge. And then anything that you could feed through the printer, like a magazine page or a photo, instead of printing, it would literally be, reflecting an LED off of it and measuring the reflected response. And you could scan an image off of that paper. And I think Tom wrote, I think he reverse engineered the format, but he wrote support for reading and writing the ThunderScan format. Building this program up gradually, like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if it could do this? Wouldn't it be cool if it could do that? It started kind of building more and more capabilities. I think Tom was putting in blurring functions and sharpening functions and edge detection and
levels.
All that stuff that was from Tom's original image processing library for the computer vision work. A lot of those things were going into the program. And at some point, I had this kind of harebrained idea of, hey, I think this has commercial potential. I think we could sell this. And I think Tom's response to that was, are you nuts? Do you have any idea how much work writing a commercial application is? And fortunately, the answer to that was no. I had no idea how much work writing a commercial application was. I was just full of naive optimism. And I thought, are you okay if I go talk to some people about doing this? All right, well, knock yourself out. At this point, I was a nighttime camera operator. So my shift was from 7 p.m. until 5 a.m. And I would go home and sleep, and I'd get up a little bit after noon. And my free time was during business hours. So without interfering with my day job at ILM or my night job at ILM, I could go meet with people in Silicon Valley, and I could see, is there actually something to this? Is there some interest in this actually being a commercial application? I had some friends at Apple that were in the advanced technology group, sort of through a television commercial I'd worked on. And I went and met with them, and I showed them what we were working on. I said, am I crazy, or do you think this maybe has commercial potential? And they said, yeah, you should absolutely pursue this. They gave me a contact at a company called SuperMac that were making video cards for Macintosh 2 computers and monitors. And they were starting to get into software. They were developing a program called Pixel Paint that was a color paint program. So I went and met with them, and they were really excited about what they saw. I think at this point, this program could read and write at least a half a dozen different image file formats and could do various manipulations to them. And they had an idea of, well, maybe we could bundle this with Pixel Paint as a file format conversion utility. And they did a sort of back of the envelope calculation of, well, we're expecting to sell this many units of Pixel Paint per month, and if we paid you $5 a unit on this or whatever it was, this is what you could earn from this. And wow, that was real money. And I called Tom and said, no, this is real. There's real interest. We can make some real money from this. I think this is an opportunity that isn't going to occur again. This is kind of a once in a lifetime thing. I think we should pursue this full time. And that I'll admit that was sort of easy for me to say because this was something I could pursue while I had gainful employment. So I could do this on the side, but I needed Tom to stop everything else and work on this
I like this
full
part.
time. I think at the time you were estimating you were about 6 months away from finishing your doctoral thesis and becoming Dr. Thomas Knoll. And I think the pitch I made was suspend your schoolwork. Let's pursue this full time. When we ship, this as a commercial program, go back and finish your doctorate. But we have to do this now. We have to do this now. And God bless him. Thomas went, okay, let's do it. And took a giant leap of faith, dropped out of school, and started programming full time.
Made your brother drop out of school. He's making no money dropping out of school.
I am why he is not currently Dr. Thomas.
Wow.
My parents weren't super excited about that.
This is another good decision.
Oh, I think my parents forgave me for that.
Is this, are we getting close to the time that I met you for the first time? You came to Adobe to give the...
Yeah. So as we were developing this, I would suggest features, and Tom and I had lots of long conversations about, hey, wouldn't it be cool if it could do this and could do this? I was an active user of the application, and I was always pushing on what's going to make it useful to artists and people that do imaging professionally. And so there were features that were put in because I was hammering on it, and then I would complain about, hey, why aren't the redraws interruptible? Like, it's redrawing the frame. I don't want it to complete that redraw. I want to issue the next command. And like, oh yeah, the MacApp framework doesn't do that. Well, I could probably modify that. And he would go in and he would modify it so that it would, have a better user experience. And I would keep giving him my experiences of using it. And hey, wouldn't it be cool if we would do that? The first version that Tom wrote, when you made a selection, it was a 1-bit selection. And I had experienced 12-bit alpha channels on the Pixar image computer and said our alpha, we want to support alpha channels, and we want selections to be able to have transparency on the edges. And that's sort of where feathered selections came from.
I remember that in the demo.
Often I would have some crazy idea of I think it should do this. And Tom's first reaction was, oh man, that'd be really hard to do. That'd be really hard to do.
How many times did you call him a day?
Then 2 days later, he would say, I thought of a way of doing that. And he put it in there. And so I think that dynamic worked pretty well, where I would sort of push for something and Tom would apply a lot of his algorithmic genius to how would I do that? And would come up with some really clever high performance solution that would accomplish that. So I had this meeting with the SuperMac folks, and they were really interested in potentially publishing this as part of their suite of software tools. They said, the financial condition we're in right now, we can't do a deal with you immediately. We want to do a deal with you, but be patient with us, and this is all going to clear up. And that was fine with me because we still felt like we had months of development left to go. So every couple of weeks, I would drop a new version on my contact there. And one day I called to schedule a meeting with him, and he had been fired. He wasn't there anymore.
Thank you.
And I realized that it wasn't smart to have all my eggs in one basket. And I decided, okay, I'm going to start going around and meeting with different companies that might be potential publishers. And I think there was a Siebold conference. It was an expo that was centered around desktop publishing. And I went to the Siebold expo that was in San Jose. And it was like SIGGRAPH, walked the trade show floor. And any company that looked like they might potentially have an interest in what was going to become Photoshop, I would meet with them and I would say, hi, I'm an independent software developer. I'm working on a software, an image processing application that you guys might be interested in. Who do I talk to? And I went booth to booth, and one of the booths that I went to was Adobe. I don't remember who I met with there, but that person gave me their card and said, call me next week. You want to talk to Fred Mitchell, head of third-party acquisitions. I think I probably met with and did demos for 30 different publishers. But I had a really good experience at Adobe. A week later, I came in and I did a probably 45-minute demo of the program at the time. And at the end of that, I was asked, hey, can you come back and do the same demo next week for John Warnock, who was the CEO of the company. And he's a really smart computer graphics pioneer. He's developer of PostScript, inventor of the famous Warnock clipping algorithm for all of you software nerds out there. And so I came back a week later and I did that same demo for John. And I was super impressed by him. He's a really, really smart guy. And at the end of that, he had asked a lot of very insightful questions where it was clear he really knew what he was looking at. And I did not get that experience in some of the other places I demoed for. And at the end of it, he made a really good observation. He said that desktop publishing is about to blow up. Yes. That we have PostScript, we've got the Adobe Type Library, we have Aldus PageMaker, we have Adobe Illustrator. The one thing that is missing from the whole desktop publishing solution that is going to make this whole thing take off is images. And as soon as somebody has images solved that can be integrated into desktop publishing, that is going to make the whole industry explode. And I think I heard around that time, it might have been from John, that the print industry, at least at the time, was something like the third largest industry in the entire world. So this was something important to Adobe, and that they want to make sure that we've been thinking about doing an image processing application. This looks like it could be it. We want to put all of our force behind making this succeed, because this is going to change the whole face of computing. And boy, that was the right thing to say to me. It seemed like these are people who are really smart, who understand what they're looking at. Adobe already had a really good reputation for being graphics pioneers in the industry. And it seemed to us like, all right, these are the guys we want to do a deal with.
Just at the right moment, it was what I was looking for as a graphic designer. I look at the $120,000 systems. Yeah. It's like miles away, and you're stepping into Adobe and showing me something I can purchase and I can use as a designer. My mind was exploding that I could be able to touch it finally. I didn't have to stand back, and programming wasn't necessary, and I'm not a programmer. I wanted to move the mouse and make the adjustments to the image. John Warnock is an amazing man, and to this day, I'm grateful for you, both of you, for making and changing my life and changing the life of millions of other graphic designers, artists, and photographers. Wow, there was my statement for the day. But continue with the story. So there, John Warnock has decided to purchase Photoshop, and it's 1988, it's 1999. When was the contract signed?
I think, yeah.
And so
1988.
I become sort of the first evangelist at the time. I'm wearing a cowboy outfit and doing demos and recording the demos and putting them on the original CDs. It was ridiculous stuff. Who dresses as a cowboy and does Photoshop demos? Only me.
Well, clearly it's worked for you.
It's worked. I have a question for both. We're sort of at that point where Photoshop, there it is, Photoshop is developing, it's moving along. You're making filters for Photoshop, John.
Yeah.
And one of my favorites, the lens flare.
Yes.
This thing I had lens flare to everything, and I put it on layers. And
so sorry about that.
And demos of lens flare capabilities, and I was very blessed to be at the right place at the right time. And I think it was you, Thomas, who decided we should include Russell's name on the startup screen. Do you remember why? What brought you to this crazy idea of putting my name on the startup screen? I wasn't a programmer. Did I make one or two good suggestions along the way?
Oh, yes, definitely. And the four names were me, John, Steve Gutman, who was the original product manager, who actually had to fight Adobe bureaucracy to actually get it published.
Steve Gutman came up with this this bolo tie as the first promotional giveaway for Photoshop. So this is quite an antique here. I think that may be the only one in existence. Do you still have one?
Oh, I've got one, yeah.
Do you?
Somewhere, yeah.
Okay. So, the official bolo tie is on here today. Wow. Can you tell this group, where did levels come from? Why did you make levels look like it looks? There was nothing that existed like it before.
John had requested a feature to adjust the gamma of images. I was playing with that request, and I came up with a slider interface for adjusting the gamma, and basically pointing to where the old midtone was, and it would be mapped to the new midtone. So it was sliding across the range of 0 to 55, basically. You kind of want to know where the peak is, so you can align it in the middle of the peak. So maybe if I show a histogram behind it, and then I had the idea of adding the white and black sliders to it.
Yeah.
So the initial version of levels was just 3 sliders. It was just a histogram and the white and the gamma and the black. I don't know if it was John's suggestion to add the output slider. So you have 5 degrees of freedom.
I must have recommended that. I'm sure I did.
One very simple dialogue.
No, I don't.
It's been a while. I don't remember.
This was the.
You guys don't remember, but I do.
This was the very first adjustment command in Photoshop.
Why is it I still use levels to this day? I'm so old school.
It's a good interface.
Yes. I color balance my images today with levels.
One of the things that I always found kind of charming about the program was that we worked out multiple workflows that allowed you to do essentially the same thing using different tool sets. And some people gravitate more to using, either the color balance tool or the levels tool or the curves tool. You can, in theory, accomplish many of the same things using those tools. But some people are more comfortable in the curves interface. Some people are more comfortable in levels. Some people are more comfortable doing things as sort of stacked elements in the layers palette. It conforms to different people's styles of working in a way that lets them feel comfortable in the tool. Like, we're not saying, there is one way to do this and this is how you do it. It lets you work the way you want to.
I would say when I was giving demos and presentations, there are 104 different ways to do the same thing in Photoshop. Yeah. It got away. I want to know, Thomas, what are you doing now with Photoshop? You're still working at Adobe.
I work at Adobe as a fellow, and up until about the year 2002, I worked on Photoshop. And being the most senior person working on Photoshop, you get to pick your projects. And one of the projects was to add RAW support for the new digital cameras that were coming out. And each of them was writing a different RAW format. And you had to write the processing. And the camera manufacturers were always shipping their own version of the RAW processor with their cameras. And they sort of universally sucked. I spent one vacation writing the initial versions of the Camera Raw plugin.
I was on vacation at the same time, and I'm in Yellowstone, and you say, Russ, you should try this new thing to adjust raw images. Wow, that was a big change. There's Photoshop, then there's Photoshop 3 with layers, and then there's Photoshop with Camera Raw. And that was a really fantastic moment to see that. And I remember seeing the guys at Nikon sort of cursing us, like, how dare you do this better than we can, So there were those moments.
If they had done it better, the RAW might not have happened. I remember Tom expressing real frustration of, God, the way they're processing the RAWs and it was the Canon software, just, I could do something better than this. And then that's sort of what it turned into.
John, do you use Photoshop on a daily?
I do, yeah.
How does it involved in ILM today?
I use it a lot just for hobby things still.
Hobbies?
That could be
another your next job. Wait a minute. What is your hobby now? I need to know what to invest in. Okay.
Well, strangely, I've sort of gone full circle, and right now a lot of my hobby hours are spent building the motion control equipment.
and there's others here who are following your
Oh yeah, I mean there's a electronics club here and a model making club, here. So I'm trying to make sure that that when I'm finally gone from this company, that I'm not the last one who knew how to do this kind of stuff here. So I think it's important that some of this knowledge is being passed on. So there are a handful of people that have been working with me on the last few miniature shoots we've been doing. So they've had the experience of doing this hands-on, running the motion control cameras and doing this stuff, so that this technique is going to last beyond my tenure here at the company.
When are you starting that up again? When am I coming back to watch this?
I have another shoot that I'm going to do in August.
August.
So, yeah. And so I'm building all new hardware for that.
I think we should go to some questions.
Version 1 of Photoshop had something called the floating selection, which is basically just like a two-layer document in a temporary way. But you have a selection, and you'd be able to like move it and adjust it independently. But you only have one at a time.
But if you were tricky, did you know you could float it and then deselect sections from it while it's floating?
Yes. The original feature idea was called multiple floating selections.
Oh.
And I sort of came up with a metaphor or analogy of how they do cartoon animation, where they actually paint images on pieces of acetate, and they could stack them together. The model I built in Photoshop was based on that. So each layer is a piece of acetate. It's either transparent or opaque or some fraction thereof. And then you can pull out a piece of acetate and delete it or move it around independently.
Killer. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So.
Did not know that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was, in the whole history of Photoshop, probably one of the most significant things that ever got added to it.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a big day, big day.
I think there are all sorts of things that are only really possible digitally. I mean, things like history brush, like how would you do that, anything other than with digital tools? Another feature to me that is almost up with levels is the healing brush tool. That is miraculous for people that need to do rig removals or paint out objects. Because before that, there was a lot of very careful, like I'm going to clone from this to this, and I got to find something that's just the right brightness and texture, or you'd paint into another layer and then do a color correction until it blended and all of that. The healing brush does an amazing job of letting you do retouching, dirt removal, painting out dust and scratches.
What technology did the healing brush use before AI? Was it just an early version of AI?
It would basically try to like match the color at the edge of the selection and do a smooth fit to it. It would copy the texture from another area of the image and then match the color at the edge.
Okay.
So we have basically enhanced this feature dramatically with AI now, because basically you have a hole, and AI is very good at filling that hole with something realistic.
Well, version 1.0 of Photoshop was written in Object Pascal in the Mac app framework with about, was it something like 20% hand-coded assembly language. So I would say the answer to that is probably no. So the first two versions of Photoshop were Macintosh only. And for Photoshop 2.5, the big push at Adobe was we want to go cross-platform. We wanted to have Macintosh and Windows versions of it, and that required a complete ground-up rewrite. So it was rewritten completely from scratch in C++, and designed to be, or architected to be platform independent. So all the image processing code was separated from all the UI code so that porting was easier. There may still be code from 2.5 that still exists in some way, but I think it was a complete rewrite.
We did an experiment with very early automated translation code that would take the Pascal and try to translate it into C++, just a mechanical translation. And we actually did start with that for some of the routines. So
it was also kind of a gift, though, because I think a lot of software would probably benefit from periodically just starting from scratch. We learned so much from the first two commercial versions of Photoshop that there was a lot of, hey, if we ever did this again, we'd do this and this differently. So I think Tom had an opportunity, and all the developers, I think how big was the development team at that point?
maybe 6 people during that time period. Yeah.
So all of them were able to Like, all right, if you were doing this again from scratch, what would you do differently? And all of that clean slate opportunity got a fresh start on that. And I think even Tom, you figured out some really clever way to do bicubic interpolation with no multiplies. And that, if you think about it, that kind of interpolation between two pixels with correct weighting is something that happens. Like, that's an atomic unit that happens everywhere in the program. If you do a resize, you do a rotate, you do all kinds of filtering, requires some kind of interpolation like that. And coming up with a smarter way of doing that's a little faster and a little more efficient, and building that into the core of the program, that's something you can do when you re-architect from the very beginning.
Give us your thoughts on AI. And this is a bad question. Yeah, you have the
third
thought.
rail.
Yeah, the third rail. Give us our thoughts on the third rail.
All right, let me reach out and grasp the third rail. In particular, probably the most controversial form of AI, at least in images right now, are diffusion image generators, right? These like Midjourney and tools like that take a text prompt and generate an image. And right now, they do have uses, but they're kind of gimmicky because you have very limited control over what you get. And our business here, we have to have very, very fine-grained control over the images that we make.
Yeah.
So right now, these tools are not particularly suitable for the work that we do because we don't have enough control. Our clients demand and expect a higher level of control, and we need a fine-grained control. And those controls are going to come. So as these tools get more sophisticated, there's going to be more and more ability to get specific with generating things that you want very specifically. I want this texture to be a little bit smoother, and I want that to be a little bit shinier. But as you start having these controls, the wielder of those tools is expressing more and more artistic control over the image that they're creating. So these tools are going to evolve into artist tools in the same way that Photoshop is an artist tool, or Maya, or any of the tool suite that we use. They're going to give the artist more and more control over what they're generating. They're going to let that artist generate them more efficiently. Give an artist going to be able to do more in a day. But just like with any current content creation package, somebody with talent can make something amazing with it, and somebody without talent can make garbage with it. That is going to continue to be true of these AI tools, because I don't think the AI tools have the artistic intent, right? So I don't think we're going to get to a place where having a good eye and talent are not valued anymore. I think where you're going to get to a place is where there are powerful tools that let an artist realize their vision more quickly and more efficiently. So I think talent is still going to have value.
So well said. So well said.
So there you go. How was that for grasping?
It was very, very good. Very good. Thomas, thoughts?
I've been working primarily on the photography parts of the Adobe's product line, the Camera and Lightroom, and I don't think a text prompt to image AI is appropriate for that. So I've been mostly using the AI as a new way of doing image editing. There's been this revolution in noise reduction in images. You could basically use AI to write image processing algorithms that are too complicated for a human ever to write.
Wow.
So it's really amazing, but there's no fundamental difference between an AI noise reduction algorithm and something that a computer programmer could write, other than the AI algorithm could be a much higher quality version of it.
Now, masking is a really interesting AI feature that's happening in Photoshop and Lightroom, and I love that capability.
Oh, that's a big thing in visual effects, is extracting mattes. We traditionally have been photographing objects in front of blue and green screens to be able to extract a transparency level to do composite, but there are now segmentation libraries that are getting better and better, and it's certainly going to have a huge impact on what we do if we can essentially not have to deal with putting up process screens to be able to get a high quality segmentation of an image. In fact, there's a lot of times where it's just not possible to begin with, where we have to do manual generation of mats to put a CG character behind a photographed character that isn't in front of a blue screen. So these segmentation tools are already affecting what we do, and it's not taking away creative work from artists. It is making artists more productive for what they're doing. And in the end, what that means for us is if we can leverage these tools to get our work done more efficiently, that means that our services are more affordable to clients. And we hear about it all the time from clients. Oh, it's so expensive. Is there any way we can make this cheaper? And there are a lot of shows that I think don't quite get a green light, don't get made because they're just a little too expensive. And if we can meaningfully use these tools to make the work that we're doing more affordable for our clients, we're going to get more of that work. There are more products that are going to get made because now they're economically viable to proceed in a way that they weren't before. So I forget what the name of it, but there's a well-known principle that anytime that you take an industrial process and you make it more efficient, you would think that, all right, well, then you need fewer people to do that work. But what the reality typically is to make that process more efficient so that it is less expensive to do, there ends up being more demand for it. So there end up being more people employed doing that work. So I feel like AI is less likely to devastate you hear a lot of doom and gloom scenarios about how your days are all numbered, there's a button that's going to replace you. But I don't think that's true. I think that you still need somebody with taste to wield these tools. And I think that having a good eye and taste is still going to have value. And there'll still be a lot of people employed doing this. I think there may be more people employed doing it if we can make this more affordable for people to be able to express themselves. I sure would complain about all the horrible abuses that it's been forced to do.
I don't want Photoshop to talk back to me. I would love Photoshop to give me ideas and make suggestions, and I'd like Photoshop to take away the tedious work of making a mask. Photoshop is this hobby of mine. I have the ability to be working for Adobe and still have a hobby at the same time. But I want something that will inspire me, give me more creativity, give me more time to play and experiment. And if that Photoshop came into being and was your co-pilot and your friend in this whole process of making and creating images, I want it to be a good friend, but I don't want it to go too far in its suggestions.
Essentially Clippy. You want Clippy.
Oh, no, not Clippy, not Clippy.
I distinctly remember watching television, some evening after dinner and seeing a character on a sitcom refer to Photoshop like, yeah, that's been Photoshopped. And that being kind of a startling, shocking experience that this thing that had started with just Thomas and I working out of our apartments had now spread to the point where it was a verb in common usage and it was entering popular culture that, characters on a sitcom were saying it. That I still see that every once in a while, and it's a little jarring because it suddenly takes me out of like I'm watching a comedy into, they're talking about a thing that I touched. Yeah.
I have the same experience, but another sort of weird incident happened or experience happens when sometime in the 90s I walked into a bookstore and there just a random bookstore and there was a shelf. And it was a shelf of Photoshop books.
Yeah, the first time I saw a Photoshop book, that was like, wow. It's spreading. I mean, I always had confidence that Photoshop was going to succeed. I had no idea it was going to turn into the thing that it's become, where it is, in popular culture. My wife and I watch, this part of our ritual is after dinner, like she likes to watch Jeopardy. And a question comes up and said, the Knoll brothers wrote this Adobe product. And it's, ding, what is Photoshop? To be a question on Jeopardy that was kind of Like pretty, very, it was a surprising experience. Originally, it was a program for displaying images, so that its first name was Display. And then after it started getting a lot of image processing functionality, Tom named it Image Pro, which I thought was a great name. It was, had all the right connotations in my mind, that it was an image processing tools for professionals. But I'd started attending SIGGRAPH back in '87, and I was walking the SIGGRAPH trade show floor, and I saw there was a company that was selling a suite of image processing tools for Apollo workstations. It was called Image Pro. So I called Tom and said, look, there's already a product called Image Pro. We can't use that name. And I suggested Photolab. So it was Photolab for a little while. And then I was demoing versions of the program for different potential publishers. And at one of the publishers, at the end of the demo, they said, "So what are you calling this thing?" And I said, "Well, currently we're calling it Photolab." This guy reached onto a shelf behind him and pulled a box off the shelf, and it was called Deluxe Photolab. And so then I realized that one wasn't a name we could use.
Then I was giving a demo to some people, and they liked the product and everything, and they were impressed by it, but it wasn't a match for them to actually acquire the technology or submit any technology to it. I explained the story of my brother's experience with the name conflict, and he said we have to come up with another code name here, or another name. His suggestion was Photoshop. And I said, "Oh, that sounds interesting. Do you mind if I use that?" And he said, "Oh, no, go ahead." And so it became Photoshop. It initially had a capital S in it, which is still a fairly common misspelling of it.
We had assumed that this was not a name that was going to stick either. That whoever we ended up doing the publishing deal with was going to rename it in some way. So I don't think we thought it was really that important that it have some super well thought out name. So we were okay with going with this, what we thought was just a temporary code name.
Didn't you say Adobe had some other suggestions?
Oh yeah, no, they were definitely trying to rename it. I remember some of the, and I'll be honest, I didn't like any of the ones that I heard them floating around. Like Expressionist was one, and Aperture was another, which Apple ended up using. Those names were all apparently failing trademark searches, and they did a search for Photoshop just in case, and it passed. And so the deadline was coming up that all right, we got to start generating materials, printing manuals, all that kind of stuff. And none of their preferred names were passing, and Photoshop passed. And I think it was being beta tested out in the world, and word was getting out that, hey, Adobe's got this really cool image processing program called Photoshop. So then I think in the end, Adobe sort of shrugged and went, "All right, well, I guess it's Photoshop then." And a really important lesson that I feel like I learned from this whole process was that we were kind of irrevocably committed to developing Photoshop. We, I think, invested already a little over a year, and I talked Tom into dropping out of school. When I found out that there were at least two other much bigger companies that were developing something that sounded very, very much like Photoshop. There was a product called Photomac that I saw an article about that sounded like, boy, line for line, it was exactly Photoshop, and that they were going to beat us to market by at least a year. And I knew Letraset was working on a version of an image processing program that sounded like it was exactly Photoshop. And I suppose if I knew that these other companies that were actually funded and had bigger development teams were working on something that was the same as this sort of goofy idea that we had, I might not have pursued it. But I felt like it's too late to abandon now. If we're not going to be first, we're going to be best. And we sort of doubled down on trying to make sure that every feature in there was professional grade, and it was high performance, and that this was going to be a really good tool for serious users. So we just kind of decided we're doubling down on trying to make this really high quality, best product. And I suppose that the lesson is two goofballs out of their apartments can compete against a much bigger industry. It's having the good idea is what's important. So don't be discouraged by the competition.
It is my theory that the Macintosh owes some of its success to Photoshop and to tools on the that were created for it.
I've heard that. I don't know whether it's true or not, but I've certainly heard that Photoshop was partially responsible for Apple surviving the 90s.
I think so.
That serious art professionals all wanted a high-end color Macintosh that could run Photoshop because that's what they wanted to work on, and that the sales of those high-end workstations helped keep Apple viable through that rough period through the 90s.
Yeah, somebody did an estimate of what all the computer computational cycles were doing on the Macintoshes during that time period, and they concluded that over half of the computation cycles were running Photoshop for all Macintoshes.
No, it's been quite a journey. I mean, I think of my involvement on Photoshop is kind of being like a proud parent. You know, it was something that you gave birth to a small child, and only you were keeping it alive, and it sort of grew and grew, and then moved away from home and had a whole career of its own, and
With that, thank you very much.